So I'm going to talk this morning and lift up two people. The first is probably someone you've never heard of, a man named Howard Thurman. He was an African-American teacher, a theologian, but even deeper than that, he was kind of a Christian mystic. He lived in the mid-20th century. He was a contemporary and friend of Gandhi. He advocated nonviolence for social justice. He's best known today for a book he wrote in 1949. It was considered a groundbreaking book at the time, and the title of it was Jesus and the Disinherited. In a biography of Martin Luther King, it is said that King studied that book, Jesus and the Disinherited, during the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, that book, Jesus and the Disinherited, was a work of theology, but it was also a deeply biblical study, but more profoundly, a deeply mystical, spiritual call to follow what he called the religion of Jesus. He wouldn't refer to it as Christian, in part because Christian had been co-opted by a more prominently white church, which used Christian to oppress African Americans. Thurman points out that we must understand Jesus in his historical context, the time in which he lived, who he was speaking to in his social world, and he asserts, understandably so and truthfully so, that Jesus was a poor Jew who lived in an occupied Palestine, Israel, occupied by a Roman military colonial power. He was, Thurman claims, part of what was called the disinherited, people who have no power, people who were oppressed, he himself, people pushed down by those with political and economic and social power, a people he described more often than not as people with their backs against the wall. No hope, no future. And Thurman asserts that this is who Jesus is speaking to. Jesus was one, he claims, of those disinherited, powerless people. And he spoke to those disinherited and powerless people. That Jesus' life and his teaching was a guide for those who found themselves oppressed, to how they live in a reality and respond with a spirituality of compassion and grace to this very reality of their experience of powerlessness and yearning for a more loving and just world. And I do think, even though that book was written 75 years ago, it has a lot to teach us these days when we find ourselves, all of us ourselves, praying for and in relationship with those we might identify as disinherited. Those in our time, whether they be refugees or immigrants, whether they be trans children, or whether they be the poor. So let's admit from the start that the very words of Jesus we read this morning are startling to our ears. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are those who weep, jars our senses with the seeming contradictions in those blessings. Especially these days when our own Christian theology is tinged, we have to admit, by a kind of prosperity gospel, which asserts, well, faithfulness, if you're faithful, you'll be rewarded by blessings, right? Usually blessings both material and spiritual. We know kind of a common understanding, a common theology these days. We know we are being faithful when we have success. Defined more often than not by plenty, by abundance. Whether it is as an individual, but isn't that we define success as a church? The 3 B's, buildings, bucks, and butts, right? That's the prosperity gospel, and what Jesus lifts up is the exact opposite. Jesus' words run counter and challenges this understanding of the gospel. Now, I thought this might be a kind of stupid example, but it really occurred to me, in part because the Super Bowl happened recently. How Jesus' words turn upside down our expectations. Now, it's one of my, I have to admit, irritations, one of my pet peeves when watching a football game, and they interview someone who's a winner of the game. And they often start, and who of us hasn't heard this, that they want to say, first of all, thanks be to Jesus for our victory. Now, it's a pet peeve for me as if Jesus really cared who won the football game, right? Right? So I'm irritated by it somewhat. Even the Super Bowl, I don't think Jesus cared who won the game. Now, I do know at some part that they're trying to be faithful witnesses, maybe thanking God in some ways for their talents or the hard work, which is certainly something to lift up and give thanks to God, but it still just kind of bothers me. So I've always had this thought experiment. Imagine, what if they interviewed someone from the losing team, right? Who would then say, let me start by thanking Jesus for our loss. I love that idea. The loss will make us better people, more persevering or stronger or more appreciative of winning when we do. No one ever thanks God for losing. Yet, that's what Jesus seems to be saying this morning, isn't it? And then Jesus doesn't stop there. He makes it far more problematic. Because I don't know if it jumped out at you, but it jumped out at me. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full. Woe to you who laugh now. The Greek word for woe is not necessarily a condemnation, but it's an expression of anguish, of sorrow. And again, it jars my ears, if not your own, because I must confess, because by most measurements of this world, I am richer and more full than probably 99% of the rest of the world, right? Jesus' words strike me deep because I'm certainly not one of the disinherited or oppressed, being as hard as it is to be white and male and well off, right? So what can these words speak to me? I cannot help but ask, what is Jesus trying to teach us? Most of us here this morning who are by any measurement of the world rich and full. And so I find myself, I don't know about y'all, stuck there, trying to make sense of Jesus' intention, his desire for my life and discipleship. Now, I am not one who hears Jesus or understands him to be about shame and guilt. In fact, the exact opposite is what I believe. Jesus' intent here is not to condemn us for any of us, whether it is by luck or work or genetics. We find ourselves by most measurements rich and full. Because after all, Jesus consistently through the gospel broke bread and loved people who were could be described as rich and full. Jesus called disciples who supported his ministry with their resources, who shared them abundantly. So how do we come to terms with these words? So one way I would submit to you this morning is to hear this as a call to listen to the poor, as a call to listen to the oppressed. Because, as Thurman says, Jesus speaks to us from those who have been disinherited. It is in listening to the poor that we catch a glimpse of God's true intent for us, a more just and peaceful world. It is in solidarity with those who are hungry that we really have the sense of our true calling as a follower of Jesus. It is in identifying with the weeping of the world that we find the path to true joy. In a time, in a day and time, in which being poor and homeless, things are stripped away from them more and more every day. In a time when refugees and immigrants are scapegoated as the source of evil and fear, do we seek to listen to them? In a time where LGBTQ rights are threatened, who are we in solidarity with? I think this is what confronts us in Jesus' world. Not guilt, not shame, not denunciation, but a call to be in community with, in relationship with those who are poor and hungry and weeping. So the other person I'd like to lift up, and it's appropriate because I think Lou Ann lifted up El Salvador. And one of my heroes of the faith was a man named Oscar Romero. And Oscar Romero was called to be the bishop. It was bishop, wasn't it, Kathy? He was called to be the bishop, archbishop, thank you, to serve in El Salvador. And part of the reason Romero was identified was he was seen as the safest choice. In a time in El Salvador in which there was revolution and death squads, El Salvador, if you're not aware, is one of the poorest places in the world. In a very violent time, there were members of the church resisting the government, asking and trying to be in relationship with the poor. And Romero was actually identified as someone who wouldn't necessarily charge or challenge those in authority. Yet Romero changed and began to see his ministry in many ways most profoundly as being in relationship with the poor, as siding, in a sense, with those who are poor. And he wrote, "When we speak for the poor," which he thought was very important, "please note that we do not take sides with one social class. What we do is invite all social classes, rich and poor, without distinction, saying to everyone, let us take seriously the cause of the poor as though it were our own." The ones who have a voice must speak for those who are voiceless. Romero ultimately was assassinated for siding with the poor, because his was a voice that spoke for those who were voiceless. To God be the glory this day and forevermore.